Excellent. Right, so I'll just give a bit of an introduction about myself. So my name is Mel. I work as a technology consultant for a data orchestration, conversational intelligence and ethical digital startup company here in the UK. We primarily work with the NHS. I started my career in digital and technology back in 2005, where I worked as a Flash developer for an independent educational publishers. Don't know if anyone remembers that tech, but it gave me some highly amusing years of animation fails anyway. Then when Flash tech was phased out due to its lack of accessibility and poor performance, I decided to sidestep and became a UI developer using web tech. So I was working for a web agency for a number of years before I then went self-employed to do the same thing. So I was in the industry for about 10 years at that point. It was actually during this time that I started to work for the BBC in the internal technologies insight team called Blue Room. It was a freelance technologist role. Did it for about 3 years. The role was essentially to continually research the consumer marketplace for new and emerging technology, and then provide insight to BBC staff and strategic externals about the impact that this has upon audience behaviour of interacting with digital content. So what were the experiences like? What were the devices like? How were they consuming, creating and sharing digital content? Ultimately translating this into what it meant for the BBC in relation to workforce skill or content strategy. Then there's a little blip in my career. Oh, you've just upgraded it, nice. Then there was a little blip in my career from the self-employed total work loss due to the pandemic, where I went to go and work in a warehouse with some robots for the world's largest data company. But that story will have to wait. So anyway, so I've popped my details on here for anyone who would like to connect. I occasionally share interesting stuff that's related to this topic. So let's move on. So what are dark patterns? There's a perfectly good summary doing the rounds, if you've not heard of it before. So a dark pattern, also known as a deceptive design pattern, is a user interface that is being carefully crafted to trick users into doing things. They're actually a result of 3 decades long trends. So one from the word retail, which is deceptive practices, which you can see over on the left part of the screen. The second one is from research and public policy, which is nudging. And the third is from the design community, so growth hacking. So deceptive practices, essentially when consumers are prevented from making an informed choice. Nudging, which I'm thinking a few of you will be aware of this, when shaping of the environment takes place, also known as the choice architecture, influencing that one option is chosen over another. And then there's growth hacking, which is a subfield of marketing focused on rapid growth, of a company. So I don't know if you've ever seen at the bottom of the emails, this email was sent by X, get your free account today. So that's a really simple example of growth hacking. So the phrase itself, dark patterns, or the neologism, isn't new. In fact, it was actually coined by Harry Bridnell here in the middle on July 28th, 2010. So they actually turned 12 next week. So it was coined after he set up the website darkpatterns.org with a goal of naming and shaming user interfaces that puts shareholder values before the values of users. So let's have a look at some basic examples of dark patterns. First off, dark patterns aren't just restricted to the look and feel of a UI design. They're underpinned by all kinds of psychological trickery, and they're all designed to coerce users into behaving in certain ways. Ultimately, there's nagging, obstruction, sneaking, interface interference, forced action. But in the examples here, you can see the cancel button is being presented differently. And then there's also, underneath that, there's disguised adverts that blend in with page content. And even cute robots don't escape, with some researchers arguing that dark patterns are being used for the cuteness element. Which sounds a bit dystopian, but not unbelievable if you think about it. So if you were presented 2 different robots, ask yourself if you would interact with or trust the most the Q2 of the two or not. So there's so many other patterns out there, and they are so prolific across a wide range of digital interfaces. I have no doubt in my mind that all of you would have encountered them on a daily basis as well, for many, many years. So have you ever seen it when the most expensive delivery option in a basket is automatically selected upon page load, despite free delivery is actually of most benefit to users, and in some cases a market differentiator. All those annoying little sort of notifications when you're booking a hotel room that tell you 77 people have booked the same room in the past hour, even though the hotel may only have 10 of the same rooms, instilling a false sense of urgency and pressure to book. Or the overly complicated, misleading wording for the opt-out of marketing on forms. But the one that really tops the chart for me is differential pricing. So this uses cookies to incrementally inflate prices for users who behave and suggest they're desperate to make a purchase. This is most commonly associated with price comparison or airline websites, but I'll put a link to the article for that at the end of this. So I'm quite interested, so this was the interactive part that me and Becky were going to do. Now we can either, Becky, move to the next couple of slides, there's only two, or we can have a bit of a discussion here around anyone else's experiences.
Yeah, I think we'll do that. Just jump in and check in what people are thinking right now, or maybe they have additional ideas, or they want to come at it from the impact it could have on vulnerable people. But yeah, let's check in. Anyone wants to jump in? Otherwise, I think it might be back to you now.
Can you think of one that you experienced, Becky, in the last 12 hours?
So that, oh, there we go, Jeff. I thought you would jump in, Jeff. Please do.
Thanks, Becky. So yeah, I think the area we most often see dark patterns is probably in cookie consent. That's the one that's most visible and obvious to most people. And I'd just be interested to get your perspective on that. As Becky knows, I did a talk on cookies and we highlighted the dark patterns element of the consent models that were going on, and the number of mental health platforms that were operating and utilizing some of these dark patterns. And I don't think in most cases it was necessarily malicious. I think probably it was just not thinking and focusing and considering and just almost accepting this was the way things were done. So I'd be interested in your comment on the sort of, we say, acceptance and naturalization of dark patterns in web engagement.
And Jeff, I'm going to find that link to your talk just to drop it in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that's a really important point. So we're doing, at HD Labs, we're doing a lot of exploration around consent because we build natural language models. We need to make sure that the consent, say we gained like 6 months ago, isn't resulted in a consent that is no longer applicable in the next 12 months after a model has learned, it's sort of grown and become more autonomous with the time lapse of new data as well. So it's a really interesting area that we need to have discussions around. But to come back to an area of consent in terms of web interfaces, I mean, I think most of the interesting sort of instances is what data is being used for. So on the surface of it, you're asking a user to consent giving their data, okay, to this platform that you're currently interacting with. But you may not be aware that you're also consenting to that same data being blended with third-party data sets, and then in turn, their third-party data sets being blended. And then this is where you can kind of start to see the sort of starburst effects of where your data ends up. And this is why it's very difficult. So in terms of addressing consent, needs to be understood, the sort of data flows, I think, before you can then really start to think, okay, well, if I want to mitigate risk data of a patient using a mental health app of mine that I've developed, you know, how do I make sure it doesn't end up in competitors' sort of data set through third-party sharing and blended data? So yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I hope that kind of sort of gave some insight in terms of where we're up to and what our thinking is. Should we move on?
So yeah, just checking for hands and comments, but yep, go for it, Mel.
Nice. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the names for these patterns and their methods. So hopefully, well, I mean, these are actually my absolute favorites. There are a lot more than this, but I'll start off with the first one. So Roach Motel, it's quite an appropriate analogy for it's easy to get in, but difficult to get out. So if you think of commerce companies that make it incredibly easy to sign up to a premium service, but then make it incredibly hard to cancel that membership or service. But it also doesn't stop there. So by the time you actually do manage to cancel that membership or subscription, they then start to deploy and use certain types of UI design to make you feel like you're missing out way more than you actually are or would be. And so that's kind of tapping into the sort of FOMO element, so the fear of missing out. Then you've got friend spam, which I didn't realize this was called this, but there you go. So this is where you're asked for your email or social media permissions under a pretense that it will be used for a desirable outcome for you, such as finding friends for you, to then only spam all your contacts with a message that claims to be from you. So that's an interesting one. I didn't realize that was called that. And then I know we weren't supposed to mention names here, but this is a difficult one. So this is privacy zuckering, the last one. So this is when users are tricked into sharing more information than they would normally intend to do. So think of all those social media games, all those IQ quizzes, and those seemingly fun, what animal in a relationship are you type quiz. They're all designed for sort of data harvesting without you kind of being aware of that. Moving on. So if we think about the psychological implications of these methods and dark patterns in general, so this is where I'm kind of going to lean on Becky somewhat, whilst I don't come from either a sort of healthcare or academic background, as I wouldn't really want to say anything untoward, but in terms of the psychological impacts and sort of lasting longer term effects, or even the psychological implications as each generation comes through. So you have, just this morning actually, I was reading an article around Gen Z and how they want to communicate and interact with their healthcare. So how do they want healthcare delivered to them? You know, some Gen Z have only ever experienced doctor's appointments as a young adult through Zoom due to the pandemic as well. So yeah, there's going to be psychological impacts on that as well. Or if you ever seen the famous article of a baby swiping a newspaper, you know, it's basically those kind of psychological impacts. Becky, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I do. And I'm going to pass the baton because we've got some therapists and providers in the room. So I'm happy to comment from a mental health research perspective, public health perspective. But I think we've got some other very credible voices in the room. So obviously people can't speak about clients and things, but has anyone had experiences in this space or heard about clients or users? And just while you're thinking or putting your hand up, sorry, because I've also got a million things flying around, just to mention that I think this topic matters so much that not only will we want to write up something, obviously academic or white paper, but then I think we need to start approaching providers as well. And so the video that I showed earlier with Jeff on doing some cookie checks on some companies, we can treat this almost like an intervention where we can then approach the providers and ask them if they would be willing to do X, Y, Z. And again, all of the really interesting stuff that Mel, you just showed, these are things that we could also engage with and approach to ask what are their current practices and whether they'd be willing to change those practices. And so to survey or to intervene to the provider space. So yeah, I'm just looking. Okay, Kath, yeah, hands up, Kath. There you go.
Wow. Yes, certainly in terms of, and Jeff knows this because I've talked with Jeff about this as well, certainly in terms of those cookies, the trackers, there's a number of membership bodies that do this, never mind about the apps that people connect into. There is a large membership body in the United Kingdom with over 44,000 qualified and registered members. And on the main web page, there's 26 ad trackers, 26 ad trackers and Google tracking that wants to know your location when you first log on. So that will be happening to all of the clients going to the website for a start off. And some of the organizations and services that I've used in terms of advertising, they also have these trackers, which means that, for example, a client who is searching around for a health professional will go to one of these advertising services, unfortunately not knowing that they're being tracked at the time. And also where I have signed up for some services before and put messages out that you need to clear your cookies and cache. I've been approached by some of them to say, why are you putting this in your profile, your advertising profile? And further to that, I then get marketing emails from those companies, and they tend to come through different email addresses because I use different ones, basically so I can see who's tracking me doing what, where and when. And I find that a lot of the advertising platforms and services that I use will also email me as a marketing strategy.
Yeah, it is a bit of a minefield, isn't it, when you start to unpick it all? I mean, there's a couple of things in what you said that I'd like to sort of respond to. So the first thing is, I actually remember working as a UI developer when cookies were first introduced as a requirement. It absolutely sort of was staggering for me to realize that they were pushing that kind of expectation and ownership on people that were building their websites. For me, it should have always been the browsers that stepped up to the plate for that one. I think it was potentially the wrong thing to do, to make web owners individually sort of, communicate what they're doing with cookies to their users. I think it should have been way more robust as a sort of solution to that point. But it comes back to what we were saying before about data flows and blended data sets and third parties and uses that of sharing data that way. It is a starburst effect. And how you were saying, Kath, about, you were getting communication from advertisement companies and you were just like, why am I hearing from these people? That's kind of come from that third party sharing of data and blending it all with multiple companies who just purchase data sets and then blend it into one database. And then they do the same with their sort of third party companies that we work with. So yeah, it actually kind of leads quite nicely into the next slide. So I'm actually going to move along and talk about so what's sort of being done in the regulation or sort of initiatives from designers themselves. So I've picked out a handful here. So I'm just going to run through them quickly. I'm just aware it's 25 past. So I've also put at the end of this, if anyone wants a copy of this presentation as well, the links to everything I've discussed on here. So if I whiz through them too quickly and you didn't quite catch any kind of gory details, you'll be able to do some further reading.
And Mel, just so you know, even though we'll have like an exit if people need to go at 40 past, we've upgraded so you can, take your time and revisit any ideas in more detail. But yeah, and people just jump in. Don't feel this is a lecture, it's interactive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you've got any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand or pop a question in the chat. So I'm just gonna go through some of these descriptions on here. So in America in 2018, well, actually, firstly, I think it's important to realize that there's many things happening and being set up in the world to respond to the ethical uses of data and AI with acts, principles and guidance and frameworks and regulations all spiraling out from all of this. So responding to dark patterns, I think would be better considered as a sort of collateral response. Because I think for the purpose of this session, it would take too long to unravel all the legal to find the relevant bits for this particular session. But having said that, I think specific regulations for dark patterns are generally still lacking. But here's some anyway that I consider hopefully helpful and of notable, of sort of notice. So in 2018, there's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's a state statute. It's intended to enhance the privacy rights and consumer protection of California residents. It's basically a set of intentions to provide the residents with rights such as accessing the data collected about them, where it goes, how much data is collected. It's aligned almost identically with the European GDPR principles. Then in 2021, there was a coalition of the EFF, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Consumer Report, Access Now, PEN America, and darkpatterns.org. So if you remember, that was Harry Brignall before. So they've set up a what do we call it? A dark patterns tip line. So if you want to submit to this website when you've experienced or encountered a dark pattern, then you can start reporting as a member of the public what this pattern was, the who, the what, the when. So you can start to report. So basically, the main goal of this dark patterns tip line is for the want of stopping dark patterns on the web. So to achieve that, they need to first assess what's out there and what's happening. And then they'll use these examples to influence policymakers and lawmakers. So that's quite an interesting one to watch. In the UK, we all know about GDPR and our own version coming up and the National AI Strategy. We already know about these ones, but not that many people tend to know about the ICO issuing the Children's Code Design Guidance. So that's around, just scrolling down. So it's a code for operations of social networking services when minors are the users. So it looks to prohibit nudges to draw users into options that have low privacy settings. It's also a code that is enforceable under current GDPR. Then in Saudi Arabia in 2020, the Saudi Data and AI Authority, they announced the Saudi National Strategy for Data and AI. That's part of the 2030 vision Saudi Arabia has in terms of wanting Saudi Arabia to be a global competitor for digital marketplace. So that's an interesting one to watch, although there's not really too many details that come out of that one yet. And then elsewhere around the world, there's a general rise in human-computer interaction research and researchers. So there's quite a lot of sort of showing signs of trending in educational and academic institutions. And then in 2013, so going backwards in time a little bit, Gary Bunker, if you've not heard of him before, is an interesting person to watch. So he contributed with a suggestion of a code of practice for UI and UX developers. So it's a set of, it's basically a code of conduct, sorry, that they can adopt and apply to their working practices. And then lastly, in 2014, there's DIMH2022. Not too sure how to pronounce the person's name properly. He presented as part of a book he was writing, a manipulation matrix. So it's a matrix tool that's meant to help the uninformed design decisions in terms of what shade of dark, shall we say, is the design decision that you're thinking about using. So that's an interesting sort of thing that exists out there. In terms of what individuals may be able to start doing right now, whilst all these regulations and policy level are starting figuring out what to do. So there's a couple of things that I'm just going to kind of throw out there that you could potentially start doing. So first one is to go beyond the superficial sort of A/B testing metrics. So when you're developing a user interface, that might be just a button produce more revenue if it's green or purple. So that would be an example of A/B testing. And then you would serve those options up to different users on the same website, depending on a sort of split IP selection. It's because most A/B tests are hyper-focused on metrics that are relevant to our company's bottom line. So it can unintentionally lead to dark patterns being developed. So just be a bit more sort of wary of that and sort of really start to question the sort of results of your A/B testing. The next thing as well is to self-regulate or get yourself regulated. So as public awareness of dark patterns grows, so does the potential for fallout. So think about how to make a start on getting ready for this. Be pioneers, basically. Be ahead of the curve on that one. And lastly, ethics. So my favorite area. So incorporating ethics into the design process. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't already happen, but I'm just saying make it more of the actual sort of product development lifecycle that you're using, and really start to incorporate it rather than using it as a tick box exercise, which has been seen, because ethics should be a continual iteration as well. It shouldn't just be a one-off procedure that happens. So, I mean, incorporating ethics into a design process as well isn't necessarily the scope of individual designers, but you know, you can start to raise as an individual the sort of awareness within your organization. Further reading, again, as I said earlier, that I would drop out some links in terms of what I've covered today. There's some extra ones in there as well. So down at the bottom, the resources, the dark patterns tip line is one that I'm going to highlight here, because I think that's got some really interesting work to come from it in the next number of years. So it'd be interesting to see evidence of that starting to influence laws and policies. It'd be interesting to see it on a global scale and how it translates as well. I mean, the companies involved are sort of US organizations, but the EFF is a global community interest company, or not-for-profit, sorry, not community interest company. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that translates globally as well, and where it gets used. So to finish up, does anyone have any questions, or has people seen anything different to anything that I've sort of thrown out there today, or anything like that? What do we have in the chat?
It's been a little active, I gotta say. People are, yeah, Jeff proposed an interesting thing. Just, you know, people ask questions to Mel, but just as a side track, you know, can nudging be used for good? So is there a safe way to do that? And to be honest, I kind of wonder that as well, especially with my work in hip hop. It's not always straightforward. So yeah, any thoughts there by anyone? But yeah, check out the chat as well, people. Just gonna let a couple more people in.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Can nudging be used for good?
Yeah, it's very easy. I think you can. I've got a bit of an echo. Sorry. Yeah, I think you can. There are ways of nudging people in helpful directions. So I think, but the only thing I see, and I've seen loads and loads of pitches, is that it's all about numbers. It's all about how many people. It's all about the user numbers. It's not. Don't hear the pitches around true value of users over, what was your thing? Users over shareholder value. I think it's I just think that the priorities are about apex, really, and it's just very unhelpful priority. Ask about face just to kind of that's all there is, and with all of those, I think all of those elements that you've described, I've seen in pretty much all over the place. Let alone me trying to pay my parking fine, object to my parking fine yesterday. The link was broken, wasn't it, to pay to actually appeal it, but the one to pay it was not working fine. Buggers.
Coincidental, isn't it? If you believe in coincidences. Yeah, it's used for good. I mean, I think to answer that question, there's lots of different other things that you need to consider first before you can answer that question. So if I think about the work that we do here, the level of vulnerability of users is an area that we would need to consider, because what may be a helpful nudge for someone who may be sound of mind may not be the same for someone who isn't. There's also the neurodiverse community as well, and people thinking differently. How would you make sure that the same nudging technique would be understood in the same way across these different types of sort of community users? So,
I mean, every action has consequence, right? Just like side effects of drugs, they're not side effects, they're ill effects. And we just work on the effects that we want to work on, which are the most helpful. And I don't know whether this is still true, but when I was working in an incubator, one of the competent tech people went off and did something with voice. We would knocking MVPs up, and he did something on a voice activated thing. And he piloted it amongst his friends, and he heard all of the conversations of all of his friends and got transcripts of them coming through automatically. Now, and he just said he was so disgusted by it that he just dropped it like a hot brick, and then just said, "I'm never going to work on this technology. It's awful." Now, if you put someone with paranoia or maybe active psychosis, or someone with persecutory kind of experiences, and then people know. Or people interpret a degree of threat. I can't believe that when they find out about that's going to be really helpful. That there are devices. My telly's talking to me. Well, actually, there are devices that are listening to you, and I just can't believe that's a healthy place for people to be once they understand this. And I think there's some I don't know, I have no idea what to do. I'm sure the cat's out of the bag, but it's just kind of it's got to be an adverse mental health intervention, surely, by having it.
Yeah, I mean, sort of voice activated devices or an entire different kettle of fish in my world of technology, because I mean, all you have to do is look into the sort of release logs for the developers of these such devices to kind of get the interesting detail of what these devices actually do in homes. So I think there was it wasn't part of release, but I have read in sort of developer notes for one particular device that it would listen out for the sound of glass being broken, and then potentially notify emergency services. So you know, it's some of the stuff is mind-boggling, and when it comes down to the ethics of it, you know, you can kind of understand why a majority of thinking doesn't make it actually into the leaks, but when it does, it has catastrophic effects.
Or adolescent users on Facebook talking about suicide, and then they get people busting the door in because they think they're, you know, they're doing something. These automated reporting things are awful. But on the other hand, if I knew that someone I was working with online who was at risk of death, and I knew where they were, and I knew they were in their house, for example, and I could, you know, I think there might be some, you know, I think there are going to be some elements that could be useful, and it's just I've got no solutions, but I don't want to just say it's all bad. Yeah,
absolutely. That is also the sort of double-edged sword, isn't it? That a lot of this is considered dystopian and a bit doom and gloom. You know, technology is a great thing, and it can be used in a great way. You know, you don't have to be any particular PhD or you know, higher educated to know that. You know, all you have to do is look at computers and mobile phones. But yeah, it does become a bit of a minefield, doesn't it? But I think ultimately user interfaces are facing a period of change as well. So, I mean, we have the exponential curve of the use of AI, which, you know, is going to see and take along with it more physical, real world uses. So when that starts happening, you know, interfaces are going to have a bit of a challenge of navigating, you know, new ways of interacting. So the metaverse is raising a lot of questions. I mean, the phrase metaverse, I'm not a fan of, completely honest, but it is raising a lot of questions around what a new UI for that should look like and what the experience of that is. So, you know, but it brings opportunity to do things better. It's not always doom and gloom as well. So I think that the conversations and the discussions increasing around the world happening now is a good thing. And like I say, the dark patterns tip line, I'm really interested to watch that, to see what comes from that, and how that can feed into new interface design as well.
I'm just going to pause there. If anyone needs to leave, please, you know, go ahead. But we'll keep the discussion going for those who want to stay. Jeff, I noticed you were off mute. I didn't know if you wanted to say something, but I just popped you back on mute. But yeah, please feel free if you do need to go. But otherwise, happy to continue this discussion, because I think it's just the beginning. And Mel, we should definitely come up with a concrete outcome of, you know, how we want to do this, not just laying out the landscape, but actually getting stuff done and sinking our teeth into practices and making change happen.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna flip back to this slide. If you look at some of the people that I've dropped in here as well, and look at the work they're doing, they're also, I think it's Saya, Colin, Kai. They're working in collaboration with some others as well. So they're interesting people to sort of look up and sort of see what they're getting up to.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I did want to comment really, and it was around sort of the action side of it. I mean, there's to me there's two directions of attack to address the challenges here. Here we're talking to an audience that wants to do better. And so for them, what's needed is some guidance, you know, which ultimately will hopefully become, you know, compliance or industry standards. So around those areas of the utilization of dark patterns, appropriate use, or cookies and consent and all of that type of stuff, because, you know, within these larger mental health organizations in particular, or even in the startup phase when, you know, the hunger is there just to build fast, the attention to the detail of the damage they're doing inadvertently through exposure of users, just as Kath was pointing out on the that website with 40 odd ad trackers. We just need to kind of stop this part of the sector contributing to the data set around our patients or our future patients that makes them vulnerable, because that environment doesn't care, right? That environment of the advertising world, that starburst thing they talked about, that's essentially contributing to what is on average around about 75,000 data points on every single person on the internet. So basically, they do know more about you than you know about yourself. And they can track the variations and differences in that, and they will use that information to target and exploit, because there's a very fine line between targeting and exploitation, and they don't have any systems in place to identify somebody who's inappropriately exploitable due to their mental condition. So I think from our side, we need to look at how we provide guidance and help on what I call some of the simple stuff. Cookies, that can be done so easily, right? It just can be done so easy. Just don't contribute to the problem by sharing your user data. Let's just start with something bloody simple, right? Yep. And don't put your Facebook link on your website, because Facebook tracks that data, and they've got 52,000 data points on every user, right? So just don't do stupid stuff, which digital people see as stupid stuff. We've got to remember, this is largely a clinical market. These are not digital people, and they need help and support to understand how to engage with the digital world. So I think there's that aspect of it. The other side, the much longer term, harder problem, is to stop the exploitation of those that are vulnerable. And I think that's a much harder problem when because essentially you've got to go and address the literally multi-trillion-dollar market that is the advertising world, and get them to be ethical, right? And that's not in their vocabulary, right? That is not something they like. They'll talk about it if it looks like it's good marketing, but they don't do it and they don't think it. So there's a much longer term problem, and I think we can start thinking about that one, but we're not going to solve that one. I think in the short term we just focus on don't do stupid stuff, right? And don't share data inappropriately. Don't contribute to that starburst. Figure out how to block off those things. That's what we're doing in our platform. We're end-to-end encrypting everything. We're securing it. We're not using cookies. We're looking at the libraries of code that we're using to make sure that there isn't inadvertent sharing of data that comes out of those, because that's how you build software today. I mean, a Google app, for example, most people don't realize as soon as you start invoking some of the Google libraries in app building, you are providing Google a ton of very insightful data on your users. And the reason I know that, built an app, and a year or two later, once we started getting users, I get a call from Google saying, hey, we can see that you're getting all this kind of interaction and we can help you expand and grow that. And I'm going, shit, which bit of the platform did I just build that's giving them that data? Because I didn't think I was doing that. I didn't know I was doing that, and I was competent and I thought I knew what I was doing. And and then I had to go and dig into it and figure out things like, just the push notifications. Don't use Google's push notifications. It's like a mega cookie, right? They're just massive tracking tool. You've got to find other tools to use. So it's stuff like that we can. So that's not stupid stuff. You've got to be sophisticated to understand that. But that's the kind of guidance that we could work together to figure out, how do we get people building digital stuff to support mental health services to do it in a safer way than the internet otherwise allows. That's my thinking.
Yeah, I think you've raised some really, really important points there as well, as a developer of platforms.
We've got Mercedes as well. Just you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, hello, and thank you very much for the conference, because it's everything very interesting. I don't know very much about all these things about cybersecurity. I'm more educating myself, so I am in a very basic level. But I want to ask you, because I see so many threats and so many inside intel that you need to know for using all these what Geoff was just telling right now. So this makes me think that actually for anyone that wants to build this type of platforms, or that actually you need someone with a big expertise on this. It's not like anyone should be able to build these tools by themselves. What do you think about this? Because it's very difficult to keep track of all these potential threats, and you want to make your platform attractive, but at the same time you are more or less leaving the people to do, and yeah, and then you have the cookies, you have the and then everybody can build these platforms. So I think it's difficult to be able to really know about all this stuff. What do you think about this?
Yeah.
That's actually the core of the problem is, and that's something which we've noticed, is that, you know, as clinicians want to use the digital world, they don't know how to do it. I mean, and what was scary is, of course, over lockdown, is that they were forced online and used services and platforms that, you know, for those of us in the know, we'd say, oh my God, no, you know, why are you doing that? And the answer is because they don't know what the questions are, and they wouldn't know what the answers were, even if they were given them. They wouldn't recognize them. So there's a big problem, because, you know, we've got therapists and people leaping online, providing services, and in many cases, particularly the individual therapists, they don't know how to do that safely. And essentially, you know, that's what organizations like us and others are doing, is trying to figure out, how do we build a platform that's designed for this sector, that espouses the right ethics, that you know, just make sure that you can't make those mistakes, because that's what the digital world has to do. And I think, you know, that's kind of what we've got to look at here. And it's more than just the platform, but it's also, you know, the other things that you use, because I mean, it boggles me that people are getting customers to sign up to their services using their email account, and, you know, half of them are using Gmail. And, you know, Gmail's email content is scraped by Google for every single email that's sent, and that goes into that massive, you know, data profile of every single individual. And yet somehow or other, email is seen as a perfectly acceptable way to share information with mental health patients. I'm going, no, it's not, right? It just isn't. For many other reasons than just the Google scraping, but that's the biggest problem. So
Jeff, sorry.
Get that practice across, isn't it?
Sorry to interrupt you, because I could listen for hours, because I love everything you say. I just wanted to get one more question in, because Ben had his hand up, and then I think we'll probably end in a minute or two. But I really appreciate all that you said. Ben, yeah, do you want to have a go?
Hi, thanks for your comments, Jeff. I mean, I think it's terribly important to acknowledge the huge range of digital expertise in the population at large, bearing in mind that 20% of the population are digitally excluded. A third of people don't have essential digital skills at work. That actually, on the whole, people are not well digitally informed. And we should take that as a pretty much a starting point, and creating an environment that respects that, actually, and accepts it and works with people from where they are. And that actually the challenge here is the idea of self-regulation. I think we need to move towards legislation that demands that people stop exploitative practices, because I think we know that self-regulation never works in industry, you know, because the commercial pressures are not to self-regulate.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think this relates to a session that we're going to have later today from 4 to 5 p.m. UK time. Even when you're not thinking about some of the issues we've raised here, I worked with an ethical hacker, and even the way you code up EEG outputs, so brain activity data, if you code that wrong and you set certain waves, certain, incorrectly, let's just say, that's extremely dangerous as well, because you can't, going back to Mercedes, your point about not one person can do everything. It's frightening, even just as a calibration issue or a coding issue. Yeah, even with the brain activity data, you can change the outputs or not even realize you've completely not calibrated your system well. So but yeah, that's later today. But just want to thank everyone, especially Mel, for guiding us on this journey, everyone who shared their views. This is such a fascinating space, and I'm excited to dive into it a lot more. So again, thank you, Mel, for your presentation and all the resources that you shared. And yeah, this will be recorded and shared more broadly as well. Yeah, if there's any last burning desire question, we do have time probably for one more.
I just wonder, rather than having certain participants, certain factors, certain people actually being required to behave in certain ways, whether actually mental health as a term and the 300,000 crap apps that claim to do mental health interventions, but whether mental health as a term is a filter for actually behaviours that are required online about the sort of things that Jeff mentioned. The sort of things that actually if you're claiming to do something in mental health online, then you have certain obligations, and I just wonder whether they can be more statutorily held.
Mel, any final words from you, Mel? Because we can end with your wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking you may be aware of the work that Orca is doing with doing assessments of healthcare apps. I have to be quite careful with the wording here. With healthcare apps, essentially the assessment is to say, yeah, this app is safe, but a little bit more detail around why it's safe and what the app actually does. So that's a good place to look in terms of navigating this huge field of just endless healthcare apps that pop out everywhere. Majority of them, I'm quite happy to say, are most likely data harvesters. They might give some benefit in small, tiny ways, but some of them, I'll think that of them anyway. But I just want to say thank you very much, Becky, for sort of having me today. I am aware that I was a bit of a wild card for this conference, so hopefully sort of UI developers' point of view has been helpful along the way. Yeah, so thanks very much. If anyone wants to get in touch on LinkedIn, just reach out. Yeah, quite happy to have a conversation with anyone else further along the line. But again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Absolutely, thanks, Mel. And